has been with us, and he is able to give us a substantive policy address and engage with all of us. So without any further ado on my part, FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler.
Thank you. Got to punch the right buttons here. And Phil, thank you. Can you all imagine how great this is for me to be here? I mean, for years, I've been listening to lawyers and listening and listening. And now I got a room full of lawyers that have to listen to me. I mean, thank you, Phil, for that great opportunity. It doesn't get much better. But one of the things that Phil was too modest to mention is how much, particularly over the last 5 years, I've come to rely on Phil's advice and counsel. When we were putting together the original Obama transition team, I asked Phil to come in and be the lead on the FCC, which he quickly expanded into the FTC as well. And so it made all the sense in the world that that when I was fortunate enough to be nominated by the president, that I would call Phil and say, hey, Phil, can you help me think through some of the transitional issues so that we can hit the ground running at the FCC? And of course, Phil jumped in as only Phil can do. I mean, it should come as no surprise to you. He's made Silicon Flatirons and this law school into a place where law, policy, and entrepreneurship come together to discuss the present and the future. It is a unique, and I mean that, unique contribution to the national dialogue. And we're grateful to you, Phil, for all that you've done. I also want to recognize, congratulate the man who was just sitting up here, Gene Kimmelman, who has got his new posting. He hasn't even got his business cards yet. Get his new posting at Public Knowledge. You know, in baseball, the mark of a great trade is something that helps both teams. Well, I think that Gene is an example of what, in fact, was a great trade. We at the FCC have Gigi Son, and Public Knowledge has the benefit of Gene's considerable wisdom. That's a win on both sides. I've looked to Gene for many years for guidance and for a better understanding of the issues that the Commission deals with, and intend to continue to do that, Gene. There are also many people in this room who deserve recognition, but I want to call out a couple. Is Larry still here, or did Larry leave? Larry's hiding back in the corner. Okay, Larry Strickling, you know, in that last exchange, an ad-lib, top-of-the-head example of why Larry's intellect and Larry's leadership is so important to everything we're doing. And one of the things that Larry is also leading on is a new relationship between our two agencies that can help move important issues like spectrum and other issues forward. So we all should be grateful for the fact that Larry Strickling is sitting where he is. Catherine Sandoval is also in this room. Commissioner Sandoval from there she is against the wall from California. Clearly one of the leading lights in state regulatory agencies. I was out first 60 days on the job, had a Sandoval tutorial of things California, from which I greatly benefited. And then, of course, you know, you can't go through any list in the audience without talking about the birthday boy, okay? Dale Hatfield. You know, I said a few things about you last night, Dale. The things I left out were legion, but all of us have learned from Dale so many times over the years. Now, I know, as Phil said, that I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. And as the last speaker, I'm reminded of that admonition from the great American philosopher Mo Udall, who observed that at a time like this, everything's been said, but not everyone has said them. And so, if you don't mind, I thought I might diverge a bit and try and see if we could discuss a couple of other topics. As Phil said, tomorrow is my 100th day on the job. Time flies when you're having fun. And to be able to work with the great team. I've already talked about Gigi, about Ruth Milkman, who's the Chief of Staff, John Sallet, who's here, who's the General Counsel, Phil Revere, and so many others on this fabulous team is an incredible honor and privilege. But one of the things that I've tried to do is, and it began with a speech I made at my alma mater, Ohio State University, the Ohio State University, in December, was to make transparent how I intend to approach the job of FCC chairman. And if there's ever been a great crowd that gets excited to hear somebody say, let me talk to you about my regulatory philosophy, this happens to be that crowd. So I thought it would be appropriate in this forum to deliver the third installment of the three-part trilogy of speeches on my governing approach. Think about it as Return of the Jedi without the Ewoks. In previous remarks, I've focused on the lessons of past network revolutions, concluding that successful networks fulfill an enduring network compact that defines the relationship between networks and their users. Its elements include universal accessibility, reliable interconnection, consumer protection, and public safety. I've also talked about the importance of competition, which has kind of become a mantra around our agency, and how our competition policy will take a seesaw approach, where when it's working, the government doesn't have to do much, but the seesaw can go both ways. I've also spoken about the need for the Commission to remove obstacles and to supply inputs, both tangible and intangible, to spur innovation. But today's message is simple. So simple that it can be summed up as a quote from Abraham Lincoln's second address to Congress. Lincoln said, "As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew." I'll repeat it since it's the big takeaway. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that there is a close analogy between the Civil War and the challenges that inherently are placed on the FCC, nor am I trying to be Lincoln-esque. But remember, I'm the guy that wrote the book, Mr. Lincoln's T-Mails, the untold story of how Abraham Lincoln used the telegraph to win the Civil War. That book was all about how President Lincoln harnessed the new technology of the telegraph, something that the rest of America was still struggling to figure out. It's a fascinating story of what today we would call an early adopter who truly did think anew and act anew with regard to technology. And it is not dissimilar to the challenges we face today with our new networks. And it's what makes me so excited about my job and how we at the FCC have the privilege to address the new. So let's unpack Lincoln's quote. Our case is new. As is obvious to this expert audience, changes in technology, business model, and consumer preferences have presented us with circumstances that are radically different from those that prevailed a generation ago. With widespread deployment of digital technology and high-speed broadband networks, wired and wireless have led to an environment none of us could have imagined when our communications laws were written. This undoubtedly is true for the Communications Act of 1934, but it is also true even for the significant amendments that have been enacted over the last 2 decades. As Phil Weiser and John Nectarline wrote in Digital Crossroads, quote, when in 1996 Congress last enacted major revisions to the Act, it did not clearly foresee the rise of broadband internet access services, let alone their eventual centrality to all forms of electronic communications. Incidentally, since I'm here plugging books today, there is a new edition of Phil and John's book, Digital Crossroads, available in hard copy outside and on Amazon in electric form. We're in the midst of the 4th great network revolution. The first 3 being the printing press, the railroad, and the telegraph. The first unshackled information, the second tore up the barrier of distance, and the third jolted electronic transmissions into being. And each of them redefined the path of humanity. We should expect no different in our experience. But what makes our experience different from its predecessors is the speed with which it developed and the velocity with which it continues to evolve. To give some perspective on the velocity of change and how new our circumstances are relative to a short time ago, consider this. In 1996, the last time that the Congress updated our communications law, the world's fastest supercomputer cost $55 million and was the size of a tennis court. Just 9 years later, Sony's PlayStation 3 surpassed the performance of that computer. What's remarkable is that, according to the Second Machine Age, a great new book by a couple of MIT professors, we're just getting warmed up. They write about Moore's Law and how exponential growth in computing power has enabled remarkable progress over the last few decades. Their argument is that we are only just now reaching an inflection point with computing speeds, the amount of information available, and the ability to combine new ideas and capabilities. For all the ways that the computing revolution has already changed our world, the really big breakthrough, they argue, still lie ahead. There's no question that we're living in a brave new world. And as Mr. Lincoln said, we must think anew. That's what this conference is all about. Thinking about how best to tackle the challenges and seize the opportunities of the new technologies. And thinking about if and when our laws need to be updated to reflect this new landscape. Of course, it's all part of a larger debate happening in Washington. The leadership of the House Energy and Commerce Committee has begun a discussion about modernizing the Communications Act. I commend Representative Upton and Walden for initiating this debate. which is both warranted and necessary. All of us have observed the growing convergence of previously separate and distinct communication services, and with it, inevitably, the growing obsolescence of the Communications Act's categories, particularly the titles that address common carriage, broadcasting, and cable. Titles 2, 3, and 6 once addressed distinct activities in terms of production and consumption. While there may continue to be a viable distinction on the consumer or demand side, it certainly is no longer true on the production or supply side. Anyone who doubts the commingled nature of these previously separate activities should consider the 2012 legislation that authorizes the incentive auction. It simultaneously implicates broadcasting, wireless service, and public safety communications. As we consider the Communications Act, there is one high-level point that deserves emphasis. Given the dynamism of the technology sector, the FCC must exercise its lawful discretion to interpret the Communications Act to meet contemporary circumstances. In other words, internet speed means that even a new Telecommunications Act will be out of date the moment it is signed. The only way to deal with this reality is to have an expert agency capable of being as nimble as the innovators redefining technology and redefining the marketplace. We will behave that way today, and any new act must preserve that nimbleness going forward. As the Supreme Court ruled in its landmark Chevron decision, courts should defer to the government agency when it comes to the interpretation of a statute that the agency is charged with enforcing. The Commission has used its flexible interpretive authority in aid of the very dynamism that we're fortunate to be dealing with today. For example, flying in the face of conventional wisdom, the Commission several decades ago reinterpreted Title II to provide for open entry, competition, and to preclude any restrictions on output. In the process, the Commission institutionalized the preference for dynamic efficiency, new and lower cost curves brought about by competition-induced innovation, over static efficiency, reaching a lower point on a stable cost curve by permitting a company to supply all available demand. A very good summary statement of the FCC's discretion and the reasons for it can be found in the 1994 dissent authored by Justice Stevens that noted the, quote, unusually dynamic character of the Communications Act and the, quote, unusually broad discretion to meet new and unanticipated problems. I would note that 2 years later, Congress overturned the decision that had deprived the Commission of flexibility. The Supreme Court's Brand X decision is a critical predicate to today's regulatory deliberations. I find Brand X interesting for two reasons. First, it involves a very learned discussion of the metaphysics of pizza delivery. Those of you who laughed, we know who read Brand X and the folks who laughed here. And secondly, it recognizes again the Commission's authority and responsibility to construe the Communications Act in accordance with contemporary reality. In concluding his opinion for the court, Justice Thomas said, quote, the questions the Commission resolved in Brand X involve a subject matter that is technical, complex, and dynamic. Nothing in the Communications Act makes unlawful the Commission's use of its expert policy judgment to resolve these difficult questions. In the event that the Commission is thwarted in its ability to apply its expert policy judgment, then in light of the new ever-changing technology landscape, I believe the best and ultimate outcome would be the Congress's significant modification of the Communications Act. But to be clear, we are not yet at that predicate. The debate and discussion about policy is good, but any update to the Communications Act will be a long process. The 1996 rewrite took 8 years. And that brings me to my final and most important point. While the new circumstances require that we think anew about our communications law, they also demand that we must act anew. We can't just kick the can down the road. We have an obligation to act now with the principles that have been transmitted to us in the form of statutes, judicial and regulatory precedents, scholarship, and experience. A central reason we must act now is that while the world is changing, certain fundamental values remain, and they are as critical as ever. What we have started calling the Network Compact, universal accessibility, interconnection, public safety, and consumer protection, constitute the things we have to promote and protect if we are to be faithful to the public interest imperative. When being offline in America means being unable to participate fully in our economy and our society, it is imperative that the Commission work to ensure that every American has access to affordable broadband. An opportunity economy requires an opportunity network. One example of an issue where the Commission must act anew and act now is the IP transition. Due in part to outdated rules, the majority of the capital investments made by U.S. telephone companies from 2006 to 2011 went toward maintaining the declining telephone network, despite the fact that only 1/3 of U.S. households use it at all. We must act to ensure that more investment flows to the fiber optic networks of tomorrow, while consumers and competition are protected. With the Commission's decision last month to begin a series of consumer-focused trials, we are beginning, hopefully accelerating, that process. The most obvious case where the Commission must act anew, of course, is net neutrality. In its Verizon v. FCC decision, the Court of Appeals invited the Commission to act to preserve a free and open internet. I accept that invitation. And in the coming days, I will be outlining how we propose to proceed. But for now, there's some points to make on this topic. First, the court has ruled the FCC has the legal authority to issue enforceable rules of the road to preserve internet freedom and openness. It affirmed that Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 gives the FCC authority to encourage broadband deployment by, among other things, removing barriers to infrastructure deployment and promoting competition. It also found that the goals of the Open Internet Order are within the scope of the authority granted to the Commission. The court opinion specifically included that the Commission was justified in concluding that an open internet would further the interests of broadband deployment by enabling the virtuous cycle of innovation that unites the long-term interests of end users, broadband networks, and edge providers. After all, it explained, when edge providers are prevented from reaching end users, demand for both those upstream applications and for network expansion suffer. So the preservation of an open internet is within the FCC's authority. Bigger picture, the FCC has the authority it needs to provide what the public needs: open, competitive, safe, and accessible broadband networks. Indeed, that we have that authority is well settled. What remains open is not jurisdiction, but rather the best path to securing the public interest. Those are the challenges the FCC will confront with the open internet, the IP transitions, the incentive auction, and other issues. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. Lincoln uttered those words more than 150 years ago, but they remain true for us today in our mission. I am committed to transparent, inclusive processes, and our actions will be driven by the facts and the data. And on all major issues, we will act when the record warrants and the public interest demands. We at the FCC are privileged, just as were some of our forebears, to address the new. It's what excites my colleagues and me. And even if it didn't, we couldn't avoid it. There's one more line that's worth recalling from Lincoln's second address to Congress, from which the "we must think anew" line came. He said, "We cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves." This is what confronts us. And appropriately, we will be judged by our responses, whether active or passive. I prefer active. Thank you very much.
So people might be bored of the rule, but I will amend it, another audible. Either an alum of relatively recent vintage or a student can get the first question.
What's the definition of recent vintage?
Out of law school within 3 years.
Okay.
All right, so Doug or Madeline, you can decide who's going to ask the question. And if you want to give it to Eric, that's fine too. You can pass it to Doug. Oh, he's got it.
Thank you, Chairman Wheeler. It's good to hear you speak here. For our field in particular, we hear a lot about public safety as one of the pillars of the network compact and one of these timeless values that needs to be protected regardless of the technology used. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about some of your priorities in that field.
First, I'm going to turn my phone off.
Unless it's a public safety matter.
Thank you. Yes, I mean public safety is a key component of the network compact, and actually I would expand public safety to also include some of the things that were being talked here for the last couple of days, to include the security of networks and cybersecurity. You cannot have a safe public network if you don't have a secure public network. And we've tried in the last 100 days to take some specific steps forward in public safety. First of all, the resilience of public safety networks. We discovered and this was part of the regulatory seesaw. We discovered in the derecho, which swept through the Midwest a couple of years ago, that what had been the voluntary processes that carriers had said were in place to make sure there were redundant networks for 911, in fact, weren't happening. And so in the absence of the industry doing what it said it would do, we imposed that it will happen. At the last meeting, we began a proceeding on text to 911 that was, again, the regulatory seesaw kind of concept. Increasingly, text is no longer ancillary. And for key components of our society, the deaf and hearing impaired community, it's the only way that they can use the device. And the fact that a text message to 911 falls on the ground and gets lost in the network is irresponsible. The four major wireless carriers came together and said, okay, we will solve that problem. We will do text to 911. But the over-the-top providers ignored that. And so we came in and said, okay, it's going to apply to you too. It's the regulatory seesaw, and there is nothing more important in the regulatory seesaw than public safety. We go through the list that's in the network compact, and when it all boils down to is, are we able to deliver security and services to the American people? So yes, public safety will always be a paramount thing that we're dealing with.
Do you want to explain the regulatory seesaw for those who haven't heard the concept?
Well, I did a minute ago. See, you were sitting over here and you couldn't see this.
Oh,
So, I did this, okay?
Right.
Okay.
I missed that. All right. Other questions?
Chairman, I'm interested, amongst the four planks in the network compact, you describe what aggressive steps we might see on universal availability, particularly in the area of right-sizing universal service funding. I happen to work for a rural carrier who, right now, we're really looking for some improvements in federal policy, and it's long overdue. I'm interested in your views on what kind of aggressiveness we might see.
Well, I think the root of that is we have to move from a policy, and Julius Janikowski started this process and provided great leadership in this regard. We have to move from a process where we're thinking about dial-up service to a process where we're supporting broadband service. And Julius moved in that, began that process, the new Connect America Fund and other activities that we are doing in that regard. In the process, however, we also have to be rational in how we go about it. There was a wonderful quadratic regression analysis process that was in the order that Julius developed that had all the right ideas about how do you fine-tune, but became the classic example of the perfect being the enemy of the good. And so I've asked that be removed so that there is more stability in understanding what the funding process will be. But access to networks is as key a component as access to being able to get on the network, which is the heart of the net neutrality kinds of issues.
All right, other questions?
Thanks. I have a question for you. We've talked about multi-stakeholder groups extensively here at the conference. And of course, you talked about the open internet and preserving it. Where do you see the role of multi-stakeholder groups when it comes to open internet issues?
No, I think the multi-stakeholder process is an important process. I really enjoyed this discussion. The challenge of being a regulatory agency in this era is how do you, as I said in the text, how do you remain as nimble as everything that's going on around you? And you can start with the assumption that we are not as smart as the internet. despite what some of us might think. But we need to conduct ourselves in a way that is less proscriptive and more, how do you facilitate that new structure to be able to do things itself, which is not in any way, shape, or form to say that we should hesitate for a hair's breadth to assert ourselves, to make sure that competition is protected and that consumers protected, that public safety is protected, and this sort of thing. But you have to think about what is a new structure where we look at what's happening in the rapidly evolving networks today, because keeping up with them is you're on the treadmill. And clearly multi-stakeholder has to be a huge part of that process. And what I found really interesting in the discussion was there was John Nectarline's approach to multi-stakeholder, which was, how do you reach an understanding of what is best for the collective? And Larry's approach, which is a more international kind of approach, it seems to me, in terms of the stakeholders themselves controlling the outcome, rather than John's, which was kind of more recommended to the agency. In a couple of simple examples, my first week on the job, second week on the job, I called the folks in the cable industry and I said, hey, we've been fooling around for far too long on the question of unlocking phones. As the regulatory seesaw provides, if you do the right thing, this is Phil, this is it here, this is how it works, okay?
You don't want, this is the not good part, this is the good part.
If you do the right thing, then we'll lay back, but if you don't, and so I said on December 15th, we're going to go this way or this way. How do we have a multi-stakeholder process that gets to that end? At this upcoming meeting, we will be talking about a similar kind of process with closed captioning, the quality of closed captioning, where broadcasters, cable companies, program producers, the representatives of the deaf and hard of hearing, and the commission have all wrestled out how do we improve the quality of closed captioning. You know, those of us who are audio oriented wouldn't put up for a heartbeat with what those who are deaf and hearing impaired have had to put up with in terms of the quality of the closed captioning. And it's something they've been asking the commission to do something about for 10 years. And we came in, and in 3 months of a multi-stakeholder process, have a product that is going to improve the quality of closed captioning. So I think that you have to continually be using that process to make sure we're getting all the right kind of inputs, but also that process isn't the process that then ends. It continues as the multi-stakeholder process continues to put in new factors, deal with new realities, because we don't live in a stagnant network environment anymore.
Carl, actually first Sharon, then Carl, and then I think we might be
then lunch.
Done. Lunch, yeah.
You were quoted, Chairman Wheeler, you were quoted in the press recently, I think, as saying something to the effect that IP interconnection was a cousin to net neutrality. Do you think you could explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a discussion this morning, and I should look to Dave Clark, who's about 847 times smarter on this issue than I am. But there are two things. One, the open internet, the concept of an open internet is access to free, open, unfettered access to the network. There is also the question of then how the internet, which is nothing more than a multiple series of different networks that have to interconnect using a common protocol, how those interconnections occur. And that has been lumped into the open internet kind of issues, but I don't think it really is. I think it's back to one of the core principles about interconnection. We use a new internet $3.50 word called peering, but it's the same concept of how do you hook things together.
Well, I'm enjoying the regulatory seesaw. I'll explain it to you later, Phil. My question is, how does it apply in net neutrality? Which way is the seesaw tipping now?
You know, I knew somebody was going to get a creative way of making me spill the beans on what we're going to do on net neutrality. And you win the prize for creativity, but not for getting the answer.
So with that, showing his adeptness, I want to thank Chairman Tom Wheeler for a wonderful talk. And I'll invite you all to the lunch sponsored by our multiple Hogan Lovell offices and give you a boundary jumping mandate of those who are in the professional field. Please seek out, engage with the students, visit. We so much appreciate all of you coming. We thank all of our supporters, and we'll see you all next year. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for that. Really.